Welcome to The Plain Truth, a show where we get into some of the mysteries, anomalies, and the dirty underbelly of the world around us. I'm your host, Paul, and joining us this week, we have Wahid Azal, who is a writer on various esoteric and geopolitical things regarding the Middle East. Wahid, are you there?
Yes, I am. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, in the name of God, the Compassionate, the Merciful.
Well, thanks for coming. I appreciate it. And along for the ride is my friend. Sure. And Jerry, are you there?
I'm here. Welcome back, Wahid.
Thank you.
Well, a lot going on in the world. Of course, war and rumors of war and all that. But today we're going to focus on that other side of life, the esoteric, the more hidden and mystical side. And you're pretty knowledgeable about that, and you've written on it. You want to tell us a little bit about some of what you've written and what you're thinking on that?
Well, it's such a broad topic. I mean, my area of expertise is Iranian Islamic and pre-Islamic spirituality, or esotericism, metaphysics, what have you. This journey for me began when I was about 18 years old, when I accidentally came across a book in a bookstore in Albuquerque, New Mexico, authored by this very eminent French Iranologist and Islamologist by the name of Henry Corbin. And the name of the book is Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth from Mazdian Iran to Shia Iran. And this book, at the time I was 18, I mean, I barely understood half of the concepts that this man was expounding in it, but literally reoriented my entire young formative thinking about the world. I mean, Iranians living in the West or growing up in the West are generally trained to be secularized. So, you know, concepts of religion and spirituality are pretty much drummed out of us. But this book literally brought me back to the spirituality and the religion of my own ancestors, and not just from an Islamic loci, but also from the pre-Islamic loci of the Mazdian religion or Zoroastrian religion of the ancient Iranians. So I began to read quite extensively, went back and learned languages, Arabic and Persian, then went to graduate school and studied further. Like I mentioned in the last program, I was meant to do a PhD in the subject, but, you know, Providence conspired otherwise, as it were. Corbin, in a sense, acted as my very first spiritual guide, if you would, you know, for lack of a better term to put it. He both introduced me to the world of my ancestors and also oriented me to that world and to the beyond, if you would, until I met my own physical, spatio-temporal physical teacher some years later and was formally initiated into Sufism.
Okay, well, thank you. Well, let's see. I think we could start with Sufism because that's something that in the West there's a lot of interest in. Can you tell me how that relates to Islam?
Well, Sufism is one of the most preeminent branches of Islamic mysticism. And, you know, certain authors in the West, such as Idris Shah, have tried to posit that, you know, Sufism has a pre-Islamic origin. That is not entirely accurate. The reason is very simple, is because the wellspring of Islamic gnosis in its Sufi form, and all of their forms, comes from the Quran, the figure of the Prophet Muhammad, and the inspiration of his successor, especially in the Shia form with the Shia Imams, particularly Ali, his cousin and successor.
So did the Sunnis sort of frown upon Sufi Islam? Are there any Sunni Islamic sects, or Sunni Sufi sects?
Actually, the predominance of Sufism as a phenomenon is a Sunni one. And this is where things get a little bit complicated.
Oh, I didn't realize.
Yeah, it is a predominantly Sunni phenomena, although its genesis begins in the Shia world, in the succession to the Prophet. And this great Shia Gnostic thinker of the 14th century says that every Shia is a Sufi and every Sufi is a Shia. You know, although, you know, historically these paths somewhat diverge. Where in the Sunni world you have issues with the Sufis is more in the orthodox jurisprudential establishment. And this is a recent phenomenon, probably in the last 200 years or so, because prior to the modern period, most of normative Sunni Islam was predominantly Sufi. So you had the great jurisprudence and muftis of various places from Cairo to even what is now Saudi Arabia having some kind of a Sufi affiliation or what have you. It was only with the coming of these Wahhabi and Salafist movements that this began to kind of break off. Although even prior to this time, there was always tension between different tendencies of Sufism. You had the more pietistic, manifestation of Sufism. Then you had the very antinomian manifestations of Sufism, and so on and so forth.
It's almost the same type of schism we see in Christianity with the Reformation.
Yeah, right? Exactly the same thing. Yeah.
So what are some of the types of practices that Sufis would engage in? I know we often see the dancing or whirling dervishes.
Sure.
Is that the most common, or are there?
That is order specific. I mean, in the West, most people associate Sufism with the whirling dervishes of the Mevlevi order, which was founded by Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi, the great poet, Iranian poet who died in Konya, in Turkey. But what is specific to all orders is all Sufi Islamic orders engage in the very basic practices of Islam. So, for example, they all do the canonical prayer, the Salat. But one particular practice that is very specific to Sufis is the practice of the dhikr or the zikr, which is a repetitive repeating the names of God or meditating on the names of God and what have you, most of which are coming out of the Quran itself.
Almost sort of like a mantra type thing, I guess you could say.
Exactly the same thing, yeah.
Okay, well, one of the other things I've read about Sufis is, well, there's a couple things. One is they like to travel. Is that pretty widespread throughout the Sufi sects?
It depends, obviously on the Sufi or the order. The orders, once they were established and institutionalized, became very urban specific. So there wasn't that much traveling around. But there's a particular subgroup of Sufis known as the Qalandars or the wandering dervishes, who still exist in various forms throughout the Islamic world. But before the period of the institutionalization of Sufism in the 13th century, the predominance of the more antinomian type Sufis were these wandering Sufis.
Okay, and one other thing, and this is just kind of an off-topic, quirky thing, but I heard a lot of them, well, not a lot of them, but certain sects like to dress up as clowns, or why would that be?
That would be the Qalandars, especially the ones that you have in the subcontinent. It's a sort of antinomian practice to kind of defy the conceit of collectives or society, to push against the hypocrisies of entrenched collective consensus and what have you. So you have a lot of examples throughout Sufi history where these Sufis deliberately brought blame on themselves, and there's a particular sub-branch in these Qalandars who are known as the Malamatiya, the ones who seek out blame, as a means to extinguish their own ego and also to confront the collective hypocrisies of their times.
Another name we hear quite frequently in the West related to Sufism is Gurdjieff. What are your thoughts on Gurdjieff?
I am not very Gurdjieff friendly, to be quite honest. I've read his material. Years ago, I went through his Beelzebub's Tales to his grandson. And Gurdjieff, in my opinion, is a figure very much like Blavatsky in that he is basically cherry-picking from a tradition and then claiming it as his own. I think someone began a study about 10, 20 years ago, I missed the name right now, where they actually proved that much of the content of that book, his magnum opus, is coming directly from Sufi lore such as Rumi's Masnavi and other similar lore that came from the Naqshbandi order. Just to remind where Gurdjieff came from in the Caucasus, there was quite a well-established Sufi presence, particularly amongst the Naqshbandi Sufis of the Caucasus, as well as the Qadri order of dervishes in that area. And in meetings with remarkable men, at least the annotations of it, this is actually mentioned outright.
Okay, that's actually where I was going to go next, because I did read Meetings with Remarkable Men, and it mentions a group in there called the Sarmung Brotherhood in the Gobi Desert. Now, does that actually exist? Did he make that up, or is he kind of hiding an actual different sect?
No. He made that up, and he's basically taking a composite of the various Sufi orders that he's run into and kind of made that up in a way. Well, I mean, one can argue that for Gurdjieff himself, this may have a imaginal rather than an imaginary kind of significance, and that's fine if we leave it at that. But if you want to take it as a real historical phenomena that there was a Brotherhood of the Sarmun, I don't believe that is the case. No.
Okay, and just one other question I want to ask about Sufis, and where does Rumi fit into the Sufi system? Well,
he's the preeminent poet of at least the Persian mystical tradition. Him and Hafiz, who are near contemporaries. Hafiz living afterwards, and his father Bahauddin Balkhi was also Sufi in his own right, associated with a Central Asian order named the Kubrawiya. And when the Mongol onslaught began, this family moved from Balkh, in what is now Afghanistan, to Anatolia, and then finally settled in Konya. Rumi was initially trained by his father. After his father died, he became his father's successor in the teaching of jurisprudence and being a religious judge. In his late 20s, he met one of his father's early disciples, Burhanuddin Muhakkik, who then trained him and initiated him into the Kubrawi path. Specifically, after Burhanuddin Muhakkik left, he finally met his penultimate spiritual preceptor in the form of this Qalandar from Shiraz, named or Tabriz rather, the Shams of Tabriz. And out of this came about the Mevlevi order of dervishes within Konya, which today basically occupies the more popular or preeminent of the known Sufi orders in that part of the world, in the Persianate Turkish Islamic part of the world.
I was wondering, how does the Ismaili sect and like the Ancient Order of the Assassins, how are they related to Sufism? If indeed they are.
Oh, they are, but not immediately. The Order of the Assassins, actually remember that the word assassin coming from a slur initiated by their enemies, in Arabic, hashishiyun, meaning those who use hashish, were a schism from the Fatimid Ismaili state of Egypt over an issue of succession. And they made their way to Iran and parts of Syria, and they're the Nizari Ismailis, not the Fatimid Ismailis. And they formed a state pretty much just before the fall of the Fatimids, or about 100 years before the fall of the Fatimid state, and fought the Seljuks in Iran and in Anatolia from these mountain states that they were living in. Finally, then came into interaction with the Crusaders, and if one believes the lore, they even befriended the Knights of the Templar and even managed to convert them apparently to their Ismaili branch of esoteric Shi'ism. When the Mongols finally arrived, they destroyed the final Iranian stronghold of the Ismailis in Alamut, which is near Qazvin. And that branch then finally went underground, and they went underground into the various Sufi orders, only reemerging about 200-300 years later.
The mention of the Hashishim and its correlation with hashish is interesting, because I had always thought that Islam was very puritanical as far as intoxicants. You weren't supposed to take alcohol, you weren't supposed to take drugs or anything like that. But yeah, we have some of these sects that throughout history clearly have. I was just wondering if you could talk on that a little bit.
Sure. I'm sure you're aware that I was part of a process that obtained a fatwa earlier last year from the Grand Ayatollah in Iran, where we basically got him to say that psychoactive plant substances don't fall under this rubric of haram, so long as such substances don't impede the mind and lead anybody to sin. So that has been the relationship, or at least the Shia Muslims. The Sunnis, especially within their four schools, have more circumscribed notions of what is halal and haram. Whereas with the Shia, especially in the corpus of the saying of the holy imams, there's more leeway. And there's even hadith that are attributed to the Prophet and the imams, where they actually actively encourage the use of certain plants, such as the harmal, which is known as esfand in Iran, which actually is one of the most sacred herbs of the Zoroastrian religion. So hashish, because it is a plant, would also fall under that rubric. So the interpretations that, for example, a Shia Muslim, whether Ismaili or Twelver, would make of these plants is that, for example, you don't enter a mosque while under the intoxication of hashish, right? As long as you don't do that, then you are technically under the rubric of halal. If you walk intoxicated into a mosque, then that's when the trouble starts. Whereas a Sunni jurisprudent would look at the whole issue and say that this is, to quote, forbidden.
So, Wahid, that's kind of interesting. So, is that still the case?
Yeah. I mean, like I said, we obtained a fatwa last year from one of the most eminent ayatollahs in Qom, Iran, Ayatollah Rouhani. And we were in a dialogue with him, me and several associates, for about over a year, and translated a whole bunch of material for this guy. And at the end of the process, he said, none of this falls under the rubric of haram in the Sharia. It's fine so long as it's under supervision. It doesn't harm the mind. It doesn't lead anybody to sin. We, detailed for him the visionary aspect of these plants, and he said this is all okay. It's not a problem.
So what about something like ayahuasca or psychedelic mushrooms?
Well, ayahuasca and psychedelic mushrooms were the central topic of our discussion with him. And we translated copious amount of material from Benny Shannon's book, The Activities of the Mind. And he read all of this and said, it's okay, it's fine. And especially after it was pointed out that this also, at least an analog of ayahuasca, has a pedigree within ancient Iran and within contemporary Iran itself.
And that is? The
Hayoma.
Okay.
Yeah.
What is the Hayoma?
The Hayoma is the ancient Mazdian or Zoroastrian sacrament that apparently the prophet founder of Zoroastrianism, Zarathustra, was briefly a high priest, or a Zayota, too. The identity of this plant has been, at least in modern scholarship, has been a point of disagreement amongst a lot of scholars. But back in the 80s, two very eminent scholars at UCLA wrote this very interesting book, Hayoma and Harmony, Flattery and Schwartz, where they proved very convincingly that the identity, at least of one of the main components of this plant, is in fact the harmal, the esfand, which is held as the most sacred plant of the Zoroastrian tradition. They never managed to identify the other component of it, which is a tryptamine. But this tryptamine plant, there's a number of tryptamine plants in Iran. Already, Iran has species of the acacia plant, which are just everywhere in northern Iran, and also the mimosa plant and the phalaris grass. All of these are, chock full of tryptamines. And when you go to Iran itself, depending on, what circles of people you find, you quickly learn that this knowledge has been known amongst at least the Sufis for pretty much the entire term of their existence in Iran itself. And one particular order that I ran into back in 2003, the Khaksar order, they outright claimed that this knowledge was transmitted to them by Zoroastrians about 1,000-something years ago, and that they have the same thing, and they call it the Hayoma.
Okay, a question, because I think a lot of Westerners don't have a good idea. What is Zoroastrianism?
Okay.
Where does it come from? Not Nietzsche.
No. It doesn't come from Nietzsche. Zoroastrianism or Mazdaism, or if you want to use their own term, the Mazda Yasna, which means the good religion, is the ancient pre-Islamic religion of Iran. It was founded by its founder, Spitama Zarathustra. Modern scholarship and also post-Achaemenid Zoroastrian priestly scholarship on the dating of the life of Zarathustra has been a point of great disagreement. Modern scholarship has basically resolved that this figure may have lived about 1000 BCE, so about 1,000 years before Christ, and that he founded, that he, very similar to the rise of Islam, that he, at the age of 30, there was a call that came from heaven through a theophany of the ultimate, the good mind, Wahuman, who initiated Zarathustra into the mysteries of Ahura Mazda, the god of light, near the Deity River in a region called Aryana Baeja, or Iran Bech, the mythological home of the ancient Iranian people. And that he then began to preach amongst these people in that area, which some modern scholarship considers probably somewhere around northern Afghanistan, southern Turkmenistan. And this religion of Zarathustra preached a moral dualism, where you have in this plane of existence, or at least in the material plane of existence, an eternal battle between the forces of good and bad, light and darkness. The theology, go ahead.
Well, and I think in the West we would call this Manichaeanism.
Manichaeism is different because in Manichaeanism, it is not simply a moral dualism, it's an ontological dualism. So the light and the dark are equal in all levels of being in the Manichaean perspective. In the Zoroastrian one, even though both Ahura Mazda and his antagonist are uncreated spirits, yet Ahura Mazda, the god of light, is preeminent. He is the absolute, the creator of all things. And his antagonist does not have the power to subdue him.
I was just going to say, I think Manichaeanism was sort of definitely influenced by Zoroastrianism, I believe.
Oh, for sure. In fact, the prophet of that faith, Mani, claims Zoroastrian in his genealogy, in his lineage, as well as the Buddha.
Yeah, I think it's sort of like a lot of religions, just sort of a boiling pot where they took elements of Christianity and whatever else was sprung up in the Middle East.
Sure.
Maybe I can, this might be a good task. In that general part of the world, from Iran, Turkey, Egypt, what would you say had been the overlap of religions? I mean, a lot of people argue that Christianity has all kinds of elements that came from earlier religions, from neighboring areas. What do you say to that?
I say it's true. And the Zoroastrian influence is very pronounced. These ideas of heaven and hell, the battle of God and the devil, the post-mortem state, heaven and hell, these are all ideas that, at least in that particular form, were birthed by the Zoroastrian religion. Of course, the ancient Egyptians had versions of it as well themselves, as did the ancient Mesopotamians, Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, what have you. But as most of modern scholarship on religions for the last 300-400 years has proven, the Zoroastrian narrative really, first it influenced Judaism after the Babylonian captivity, when they came into interaction with the Iranians, because we don't find any concepts of heaven or hell, God, or at least God having an antagonist in the form of the devil within Judaism until after the period of Daniel. So all these ideas are very much Zoroastrian ideas, Mazdian ideas.
What about the Kabbalah, or the darker? I don't know if I'm going to say darker, but what about inside Jewish mystical thought?
Well, Judaism had various strands of mystical thought. During probably the first, second centuries of the Common Era, there was a form of Jewish Gnosticism, capital G, known as the Hekkalot, which is the contemplation of the mysteries of the throne chariot, known as the Merkava. And this was the preeminent form of Jewish mysticism until about the 8th or 9th century, Common Era. There was also a parallel form of Jewish Platonism that was founded by Philo of Alexandria, that then pretty much influenced a whole genealogy of Jewish philosophers up to the time of Saadia Ganon, and then further to the time of Maimonides. And in about the 8th, 9th, 10th centuries, there's a convergence that happens, and especially the interaction with the Islamic spiritualities and schools of thought that the Jews of both North Africa and the Middle East came into contact with, that produced what we today have or know as the Kabbalah. Jews don't like to admit this. There's a lot of scholarship that has come out by people like Moshe Idel and even to some degree Gershom Scholem that proves there was no Kabbalah in the system that we know it now prior to about the 9th, 10th centuries of the Common Era. And evidence of this, for example, is found in, for example, the Tree of Life and the 10 Sephirot. And this system of the 10 Sephirot is directly taken from the system of the 10 intellects that you find in Islamic Neoplatonism of Avicenna, which itself is, basically the medieval astronomical sphere of the heavens that are 10 in the Ptolemaic system. So the formative texts of the Kabbalah, texts such as the Sefer Yetzirah, the Book of Creation, or the Bahir, the Book of Radiance, and the Zohar, the Book of Splendor, these texts don't really come about, at least there's no evidence for it, textual or otherwise, before at the earliest, the 10th century of the Common Era. Within, for example, texts such as the Sefer Yetzirah, there is almost, you can map this out, that there are influences of thinkers such as Avicenna or even the Ismailis, the pre-Nizari, pre-Assassin Ismailis. Some of their ideas are pronounced in these books. And then when we get into the period when the Zohar, the Book of Splendor, is assembled in Andalusia by Moses de Leon, the Islamic mystical and esoteric ideas are replete within this text. Jews today, at least Kabbalistic Jews today, don't look at it this way. They attribute the genesis of the Kabbalah to a rabbi by the name of Simeon ben Yochai, who's the main character in this Book of Splendor, the Zohar.
Yeah, I think they trace their lineage back to, some mythological time with when Moses received the word of the Kabbalah from God, and from that point on, it was only, or Abraham rather, sorry, yeah. From that point on, it was only handed down by word of mouth, never supposed to be written or some such thing.
That is the argument. There's two ways to, if you look at it from a historical point of view, okay, then the issue of influences and textuality and intertextuality and all these things come to play. But there's another way to look at this. And the other way is that, for a believer, right, the historicity is irrelevant because spiritual time is irreducible to spatio-temporal time. So if, for example, a believer believes, that this was generated by Abraham or that God gave the revelation of the Kabbalah to Abraham, then that is veridically true for that believer at that point. But if we want to trace this from a historical point of view, then there is no Kabbalah before at the earliest, the 10th century of the Common Era.
I'm in agreement with you. I was just playing the devil's advocate, I guess.
Sure.
Well, okay, then I got an outsider's question or something, and someone not knowing here. How much of an oral tradition is there in all of this? How much is actually supposed to be written down?
Well,
for example, in the Sufi
with
order,
Kabbalah.
Well, the Kabbalah is a good example, but can we really expect to find writings of things?
Well, I think a lot of real teachings are oral. Plato himself says this in one of his letters, that all serious matters are not written in books. But, the nature of these oral teachings then have to be taken as relevant to the master and the student where this transmission is happening. Because such oral teachings, at least on the historical plane, change over time. They take on other elements. So if you want to look at this from the point of view of a historian, how a oral teaching evolves over time, then is the oral teaching itself the original oral teaching? And that's where, when you're dealing with issues of texts, it's almost impossible to attribute a pedigree and antiquity to a text such as the Book of Creation. The Sefer Yetzirah. It's just nonsense, to try to do it that way.
I'm going to make the argument that probably 99% of the of what's out there actually is written down or is available to most people. But if you don't really have the mind or exactly. Someone to point out and explain things, it's going to be useless for the most part.
Doesn't make any sense. No.
Right.
And one principle that the Sufis have about textuality or specific texts of the occult, you can put the most esoteric occult text out there in plain view. It cannot be opened in the hands of a non-initiate. It doesn't really matter if you put this thing out there. And I think this is a correct attitude to have towards text, and especially scripture.
It's almost like putting a baby in front of a computer, right? You wouldn't really have any concept of how to use it.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got a question, if I can then. Looking at that book from Corban, I got the feeling that in the mystical side of Islam, or perhaps the mystical side of Shia, that the Quran is not, how can I put it? Various things are not meant to be taken literally. Is that correct?
Yeah. Or
Can you expound upon that?
Sure. This is a large topic. The way that esoteric Shiism, in principle, looks at the text, okay, there is the text of the universe itself, the Liber Mundi, right? Mm-hmm. Okay. Then there is the text, which is the Anthropos, which is the universal human, right? And this is seen as being the Imam or the eternal Imam. So Ali is the living Quran, the speaking Quran. Then there is the book itself, the written book. And the relationship here is between, for example, we're talking about the metacosm, the macrocosm, and the microcosm, right? So the written word as such, in a sense, is the exoteric aspect of the esoteric, or the written word is the veil of the esoteric. And who can open the keys to the esoteric other than the universal human, the eternal Imam, which in the tradition is held to be Ali and his 11 progeny.
Okay. So does that mean that Ali and his progeny are where we get clarity on the meaning of things?
Within the Shia tradition, yes. Because they are the very embodiment of the Logos itself in this tradition.
Okay, what about in, for example, the Sufi orders? How do they feel about this?
Well, on the one hand, they look at the issue of the lineages. On all of these Sufi orders, they trace their lineages back to Ali. They don't, some of them don't apotheosize Ali in the same way that many esoteric Shias do, but the concepts are basically the same. That it is the perfect human, or the Insan al-Kamel, which is the embodiment and the hermeneutic and the hierophant of the book. And they do accept, for example, the proposition that the literal book is the veil or the exoteric side of the esoteric side of the book. So these concepts are pretty much reducible between the Shia and the Sufi orders. Yeah.
If I could jump in, I was wondering what sort of occult practices there are within Islam, because again, it's my understanding, and I've read that sorcery and various occult practices are forbidden in Islam, and I was just wondering what your take is on that, and is there any type of difference between Sufi and Sunni views?
Well, the whole body of the occult is actually emerges from within the Sufi orders, and within the Shia tradition itself, it's believed that all of this was transmitted by Ali. There are occult practices. There's occult practices of visualization. The dhikr, or the chanting, the repetition of the names of God themselves are held to have occult significance. So, trying to influence the forces of nature is done through the repetition of a particular name. And of course, use of magic squares and invocation of subtle beings and angelic entities and jinn, etc. This all exists within this tradition. Yes, so there is a lot of these practices.
Yeah, and that's actually kind of where I wanted to go, is a little bit into the aspect of the jinn, and
Sure.
maybe if you could give us like a brief exposition of the Islamic view of what the jinn are, and are we permitted to interact with them?
Well, the Quran, basic cosmology of the Quran is that God created three creations. One was the creation of the angels, the other was the creation of the jinn, and the last was the creation of humans, which is kind of the intersection between the angelic and the jinn, or the whatever you want to attribute it. The jinn, by their nature, are not necessarily evil, but the demonic realm emerges out of the jinn world. There are good jinn, there are bad jinn, there are helper jinn, there are opposites. There are believer jinn and there are infidel jinn. And human beings, however, from the point of view of the Sharia, are to keep the jinn world generally at bay. So the prayers, etc., are also, and for ritual purity, etc., are all designed to kind of consecrate an environment where these guys, kind of stay out of your way. However, there is a particular surah of the Quran, the surah of the jinn, where God, through the archangel Gabriel, addresses the jinn specifically, and claims that the revelation of Islam is not only meant for human beings, but also for these subtle beings simultaneously.
I was wondering if a lot of the Solomonic type texts, like the I guess the Goetia and other ones, now they're reputed to have come down through Jewish lines, but I was wondering if you think that's accurate. Like, do you think some of these may have actually had Islamic or Arabian type origins?
Without question. The grimoire tradition that starts to appear in the late medieval period in Europe in the Renaissance. These have exact loci within Islamic grimoire tradition. One particular one that is only now being studied by Western scholars is the Shamsul Ma'arif by this North African, or actually Tunisian, occultist by the name of Al-Buni. And this text, the Great Son of Gnosis, if you translate the title of the text, is like the encyclopedia of the occult in the Islamic world. There are other texts, many other texts as well.
The Picatrix is
the Picatrix was another one by Al-Majriti, although this text is mainly a text of astrological magic. This didn't really play that much of a role within the Islamic world itself. It really played a major role in the medieval Europe because it was translated. But the Shams al-Ma'arif is really the Great Son of Gnosis, is the text that really influences the occulture, if you would, of the Islamic world. And there are many elements to this text in various chapters of it that can be traced directly back or traced directly to the Solomonic grimoire tradition that appears in Europe in late medieval and early Renaissance.
Is that text translated and available?
No, there are segments of it that have been translated here and there. There's a dissertation that just came out in French by this gentleman, Jonathan Coulon, who's translated great portions of this text. I started translating at least the first book of the Shams al-Ma'arif about 10 years ago with a friend, but because we didn't have a critical text and didn't have access to any of the manuscripts of it, we kind of abandoned the project. I may return to translating this again because it's a very important text of high magic.
Yeah, I'd imagine that'd be quite a task. I know when they're trying to reconstruct some of these old books and old magic systems, they try and get several different sources and compare them, and there's always slight variances because different people made typographical inscription errors, etc. So yeah, it would be a Herculean effort for sure.
How is alchemy viewed in this? Because the word itself is from Arabic.
Yeah. Well, from the Shiite point of view, there's a saying of Imam Ali, the first Shia Imam, that alchemy is the sister of prophecy. That since maybe the line of prophets has ended, yet the alchemical opus, or the engagement of the alchemical opus by the true believer is participating in that higher reality of prophetic revelation. So you had quite a lot of Shiite Gnostics and esotericists and mystics that were just besotted with alchemy. And the most preeminent figure of the Islamic alchemical tradition is this figure by the name of Jabir ibn Hayyan, the Latin Geber, who was actually a disciple of the sixth Shiite Imam, Jafar as-Sadiq.
And that's of course where we get the word gibberish, right? Because his writings were so hard to decipher that we actually get a word in our modern language that derives from it. On the topic of alchemy, Wahid, does the Islamic view of it focus primarily on the physical aspect, like in the laboratory with different chemicals, or do they view it more as a spiritual type work, sort of like the internal view that man is the alembic who's working on himself?
Well, all of the above. And I think even you'll find with the alchemists of late medieval Europe and the Renaissance that the actual physical transmutation of the elements into the alchemical gold is mirroring a process that is happening internally. So you have, this whole process is like a meditation. It's like a mandala, but dealing with the elements, if you would. So the creation of the outer gold, or the philosopher's stone, is then mirrored internally in the palingenesis of the soul, the flowering of the soul into its highest state, in solarity, if you would.
How is that viewed in more, I don't know, in broader terms today, not just like hundreds of years ago? For example, in Sufi orders and whatever, what is the view of alchemy there?
The view of alchemy, at least I find in contemporary Iran, you have to, again, separate between the urban and the rural. I mean, in rural Iran, you actually do find people who have alchemical laboratories with alembics and what have you. But in the more urbanized setting of the Sufi orders, these are taken as symbols, so they're more psychologized. This alchemist in Shiraz that I once spoke to quite extensively, he was the one that really unraveled a lot of things for me about understanding the symbolism of this stuff. Where you cannot really separate the material from the spiritual aspect of this work. They're simultaneously the same thing, in a sense.
Oh, I've got a question. If you know, I mean, in Western alchemy, some of it became modern medicine, right? Paracelsus and all that. You have this idea of like the essence of, for example, plant essences, spagyrics. And,
spagyrics.
There's a process of essentially trying to get, I guess you would say, the spirit out of something, as not just some chemical, right? Is that also viewed in the Near Eastern world? Is that?
Yeah, absolutely. That's where it comes from. Yeah, of course.
Oh, I mean in today's terms. I mean, like those rural labs in Iran, are they going to be working with plants?
Yes, they are, for sure.
That's good. Yeah. That means it's alive and kicking, so to speak.
Oh, very much so. I mean, outside of the urbanized setting, Iran, I mean, you have, I would say, like a sea of shamans running everywhere in rural Iran. I mean, literally.
A country of shamans. Oh, you could do worse than that. That's interesting. I didn't realize it was so alive and well. Here it's kind of just a few people working on that, I think, the spagyrics.
I wonder, like, when we look at Western civilization, like, a lot of the European traditions really kind of get steamrolled and destroyed, and, well, maybe not destroyed, but sent deep underground by the Inquisition and the Catholic Church. And did the Islamic world have that same type of of oppression? And if so, is it still going on? Or
it depends where in the Islamic world you're talking. If you're talking about Saudi Arabia, then it's crazy over there. I mean, they execute people for practicing any form of magic, dirji or goethe or whatever. You know, in North Africa, it's a little different. The North Africans are more, you know, friendly towards the occult in general. In Iran, there's a whole industry. You know, I mean, the institutions of government and even the traditional clergy may frown on it in Iran, but it is not illegal. You know, you won't be imprisoned for this sort of thing, reading books or practicing something. In Iran, you actually have to be very careful because there's a lot of people running around claiming all kinds of things about their occult and magical powers and being able to, you know, give you this and give you that. And so it's almost a problem over there.
One other thing you just said before I asked that question, you mentioned shaman in Iran.
Yeah.
Now, is there a shamanic tradition in Iran, like an ancient one? Okay.
Yeah. I mean,
so it's not just a modern phenomenon.
No. I mean, arguably, the Zoroastrian tradition itself emerged from a shamanic tradition. You know, these people were nomads, pastoralists. You know, they were, you know, even the vision of Zarathustra, the first revelation of him at a river, you know, the Daitya River. You know, his being a priest of the Hyoma, which are two plants. You know, these are all very shamanic things. And this continues, especially with these Qalandar Sufis, these wandering Sufis.
This might sound like a weird question too, but is there? I mean, I've heard that the what is it? Is it the Kaaba? It's called the Black Cube in Mecca.
Mm-hmm.
Kabbalah.
Yeah, is that related to Saturn in some respect? Have you ever heard this theory that, you know, the black square is a Saturnian reference? What's your take on that?
I think there's even a more interesting reference to that. One of my friends on Facebook actually wrote a paper where he argues quite convincingly, in my opinion, that the square actually may have a Vedic or even a Tantric pedigree in India, because the square represents, at least in Tantric metaphysics, it represents the divine yoni of the goddess. And even though the Kaaba in the pre-Islamic period may have been, you know, the house where they had the chief patriarchal as well as the matriarchal goddesses, nevertheless, the pedigree of this may go back to the trade that was going on between these Hijazi Arabs and India. That's very possible. Also, the black stone.
Before we get off of this question, can I ask then? A lot of people say that the Roman Catholic system, the Vatican system, came out of the Saturn cults that were in the Mediterranean. Were those Saturn cults strong in places like Persia as well?
That's a good question. I wouldn't look at it that way because, you know, Saturn, I mean, the negative aspects of Saturn always, for example, the Zoroastrians, you know, actually have prayers against the influences of Saturnianism in various forms. Mm-hmm. Whether it's strong or not, you know, this is a question that may be able to, you know, somebody needs to do a study of. But I would say generally no is the case.
So would you, I guess I don't know how to phrase this without offending anybody, but do you think that there's some type of correlation between Saturn and the figure known as Satan or the devil? Or, you know, I've read different analogies comparing the two, and it goes back to the Greek and the Hermetic tradition with the god Kronos and all that. Just wondering if you had any thoughts on it.
It depends on kind of the symbology that you're subscribing to. I mean, if you take the 7 days, at least in the way that Islamic esotericists map it out, then Saturn is a kind of a father kind of figure, you know, a very stern father figure. So, for example, if you were to map out Islamic cosmology based on the 7 planets, then Saturn would represent the Prophet Muhammad. whereas Venus would represent his daughter, Fatima. The moon would represent Ali. So these are just facets. These are the planets representing theophanic influences of various sorts of gods. So it's not, they don't look at it from a malefic point of view in that sense.
Yeah, I've seen some pretty convincing arguments that when you strip away a lot of the veneer, that a lot of the religions are actually astrotheological in nature.
Sure, they are. Yeah. And this figure that I am personally besotted with, and also Henry Corbin was, Zoroastrianism. He has a whole prayer book for the 7 days where he offers prayers and literal orations, prayers to each of the 7 planets in Arabic. Yeah.
Would you be able to talk a little bit about your beliefs and where your system comes from, and maybe get into a little details?
Sure. I mean, like I said previously, I'm a Shia Sufi. So in my universe, the way I look at the symbolic, and this is we're all talking from the point of view of symbolism, not literal symbolism, but archetypal symbolism. The universe, or the multiverse rather, at the peak of which is the Godhead, which is being beyond all being. And in illo tempore, at the very beginning, the Godhead issues a pleroma out of itself, which is the universal intellect. And this pleroma is consisting of or composed by 14 aeons of light, which represent the 14 archetypal realities of the 14 infallibles, which are the Prophet Muhammad and his daughter Fatima and the 11 Imams. And from this first pleroma of light then emerges the various other levels of being. On the one hand, then you have the emergence of the realms of Elyin, or the celestiality, and the Sijin of the malefic world that then produced the spatio-temporal world that we're currently living in now. That's my symbolic archetypal belief structure in a nutshell.
That's again very reminiscent of the Kabbalah in my mind, right? With everything emanating down through the spheres from the Godhead, or I don't know if it's Kether, maybe the name of it. I'm not sure.
Yeah, Kether, or the Aur, Ein Sof.
That's
Ein Sof,
Greek terminology.
Speaking of Ein Sof, what about Sophia? Corbin's book seemed to go into a couple of interesting things there. Sophia and Sophianity, I think, was one term in there.
Sophianity.
So how would you describe what is Sophia to you, or what has it meant?
Sophianity means to contemplate the divinity in the form of its feminine theophany or appearance. And in the Zoroastrian religion, the earth itself has a Sophianic aspect, which is an archangel known as Spenta Armeti, who is the daughter of the god of light. Within Shia Islam, when these ideas then finally interfuse with each other many centuries later, this becomes is embodied in the person of Fatima Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet of Islam himself. So that, the birth of a Sophianity in the believer's heart is, their love for the mother, who is Fatima Zahra, the daughter of the Prophet of Islam. And she is held as divine by Shia Muslims, literally.
Okay, but the idea is actually that Earth is an angel, right?
The Earth is an angel, yes.
Earth is an angel, and it embodies the feminine, I guess you would say,
yes.
Right? You also have to discuss archetypes in all of this too, right?
Yes, yes.
So in a sense, Sophia could be thought of as Earth.
Sophia is the Earth, or the celestial Earth, the Earth in its celestiality, in its archetypalness.
In its archetypal form,
yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. The Zoroastrians have this very interesting notion of the Menok state and the Getic state. And the Menok state is the spiritual state. And the Getic state is the materialization state. Now, the materialization does not mean bad. It means in its primalness rather than and the spiritualization is in its, luminescent, its ultimate spiritualization. And in this realm we live in is a realm of mixture. Even every materiality has its menok or spiritual state. And the task of the believer is to, through the prayers and the practice of the religion, to discover this, to then begin to apprehend the earth in its celestiality and its angelicity, if you want.
So that's kind of on the feminine side, the earth. What would be the masculine side?
The masculine side would be Vohuman, or the great mind, which is the first emanation of the universal intellect by Ahura Mazda, the god of light himself.
Go ahead, Jerry.
I was just going to say, as far as Zoroastrians, like they essentially worship the ever-burning flame. Is that correct?
Yes, because that represents Ahura Mazda, the god of light.
So the light type thing. And I've seen different videos and whatnot by Sunni Muslims on the internet, and they're basically screaming from the rooftops trying to say that Shia Islam are fire worshippers, and I don't know if they're confusing the Zoroastrians and the Shias.
Whatever. If human beings can think more symbolically, I think we would probably resolve all religious crises in one fell swoop.
Yeah, I agree.
Well, hey, Wahid, I think the Sunnis that he's talking about are, how can we say it? They're literally trapped, literally, or something.
Yeah, they're trapped.
Their minds are very, very concrete.
Yeah, they are what the Zoroastrian would call inhabitants of the Ahrimanian creation.
Yes, for sure. Okay, hey, since we're on that, a couple of questions here. One is, how do the Alawites fit in?
Well, the Alawites or Nusayris are, for lack of a better way to put it, are a spin-off from the original Ismailis of the Fatimid period, who went their own direction and later formed their own doctrines. Their doctrines only recently, there's been a body of scholarship that has been coming out really detailing what these people really believe, and it is a form of hyper-Shiism, for lack of a better way of putting it, where they literally look upon these 12 figures of the imams, very much the same way that I just laid out as divine hypostases, that should be worshipped and realized in that sense. And they're especially attached to the figure of Fatima.
What about the Yazidi sect? Now, I've heard all manner of speculation about what they are. Some people say they're satanic worshippers, and but
no, they're not Satanists.
No, and I disagree.
Theories are the Satanists.
But apparently they worship the peacock angel or something to that.
Yes, Malak Tawus. The Yazidis and a lot of the contemporary scholarships can actually support this, are a vestige of some kind of ancient Zoroastrian or late antiquity Zoroastrian Gnostic cult. And the very name itself actually reveals this, because Yazidi is just a late cognate of the Persian Yazdan or Pahlavi Yazdan, which is the name of Ahura Mazda and his 6 archangels in the Pahlavi language. Malak Tawus, or this peacock archangel, is basically the emanation of the Godhead in the Yazidi cosmology. And Malak Tawus is like a god devil. He is both good and bad. And he's also an androgynous. He's female and male. And it's very interesting because this figure has many characteristics that you find then in the Kabbalah talking about the archangel Metatron. Some people are actually starting to begin to look at that, at the similarities in the Yazidi cosmology and the Kabbalistic angelology.
Yeah, the androgynous being, I think that's like very prominent even in Western occultism, which I'm sure borrowed it or acquired it from the Middle East at some point.
Yeah.
So how does I've heard you mention the term Shiite Gnosticism a couple of times. How is Shiite Gnosticism different from what we typically talk about as Gnosticism in the West?
Well, first of all, let's use Gnosticism with a capital G, and then talk about Gnosis with a small g. The word Gnosis in Greek just basically means intuitive knowledge, or which we find in a lot of these schools.
Sure, but I mean, there are Gnostics all over Egypt, for example.
Yes, of
right?
course.
10% of the country and all that.
Yeah, of course. The Gnosticism, capital G, of late antiquity is also not reducible to a single idea. There are various different schools. You have Valentinian Gnostics, the Sethians, on and on and on it goes. I mean, this is in evidence in the Nag Hammadi Codex, where you have 10 different doctrines, 20 different doctrines expounded within the covers of a single text that was kept within a Coptic by the Coptic Church. There isn't that many differences if you count the fact that Ismaili Shiism, whether they borrowed or were influenced by many of these doctrines of late Gnosticism, of late antiquity, the concept of the eons is very much taken within Shiism. So
do they all have this idea of archons, or am I reading too much into this?
Depends on what text and what influence and what school you're talking about. In some of the schools of Shia Gnosticism, capital G, you have this notion that Iblis is the chief archon of this world. But these ideas are later basically interpreted very differently.
Is there this idea that archons are kind of like a, for lack of a better word, a spiritual virus or something? You know what I'm trying to say.
Sure, yeah. Yes and no. Yes, in the sense that the archonic intelligence is an egoic influence, or egoic intelligence. Mm-hmm. And the task of a Gnostic is basically to purify themselves of this egoic materiality. And once that is accomplished, then the archonic intelligence itself then drops, or its influence drops from the person who has accomplished this. I don't know if you read that in the book, Spiritual Body and Celestial Earth. What a Shiite Gnostic or a Muslim Gnostic, small g, needs to accomplish is to realize that the whole universe, or the whole of creation, is the divine imagination. That the whole of these creations are nothing more than theophanies emanating out of the divine imagination of God. And once that is accomplished, then, in a sense, whoever has realized this becomes themselves a watcher, or an egregore in the Greek sense of that word. Not in a negative sense, but in a positive sense. So going back to the discussion we had the other week, when this is realized, when human beings break out of the confines of their constricted materiality and realize that they themselves are a dream within a dream within a dream, then they themselves become the realization of that thing within this world, and become actors against the very forces, subtle and material, that are trying to close humanity off from this truth, if you would.
That's pretty deep.
Yeah, it's pretty. It can go a lot of. You kind of have to chew over that a bit and figure out how you want to go with that. That's as far as getting just to the Gnostic side of it. Do you feel that the Western reading of it is the modern discussion is not really so accurate these days? I mean, are we going in a new agey way with it, or what do you think?
Yeah, I think there's but just remember that Gnosticism in antiquity was the new age of its own time too. Especially since there's so many different schools of these guys competing with each other. I think.
Well, I must say I'm attracted to the idea of an archonic.
Sure.
Kind of invasion, so to speak. Speaking of that, why don't we go on that? Is there within any of this Near Eastern tradition, besides the Gnostics, is there this idea that something bad happened spiritually to Earth, in the, whatever, 10,000 years ago or whatever?
Yeah,
it's something that we're in this fallen state, so to speak, because of this
Sure.
invasion, spiritual attack, or whatever.
Well, Zoroastrianism itself, again, authored this very idea that when the material creation, which belongs to the God of light, was made, it was immediately invaded by the Ahrimanian powers of the counterpowers. But that doesn't mean that they have complete control of this realm, nor can they, because the darkness can never subdue the light. But then this invasion itself then becomes the dramaturgy, if you would, of the story of humanity itself to overcome it.
I've got a question. It's sort of a little bit of a segue, and you mentioned an author earlier, Idris Shah, who you said you claim you're not very fond of, but have you read his book, The Secret Societies? I think it was written under the nom de plume of Archon Darul.
I haven't read the whole thing. I've skimmed through that book. The only book of his I've ever read cover to cover was his Sufis. And once I got into really studying this stuff on the scholarly academic level and through actual texts, reading original texts, the original languages, I found Idris Shah to be a bit of a popularizer and taking kind of a crypto Gurdjieffian kind of angle on this material. It might be a good reference point and introduction to the tradition for people who otherwise wouldn't know about any of this. But if you want to get very accurate about what the tradition believes about itself, I think it would be better for people to look at other authors, even within the tradition itself. You don't necessarily have to even go to the scholarship.
Okay, well, I guess the point is in that book, The Secret Societies, it's more of a history, and you could almost make an argument that there's almost like a direct line between these various secret societies that trace all the way back to the assassins, and then through I think it's called the Roshiana or something in Afghanistan, through to the Illuminati, and eventually into the Rosicrucians, and
Sure.
also the Templars and all that. Do you think that that's true, or do you think that it's just there's a lot of cross-pollination all over the place?
There is both going on. There's a lot of cross-pollination going on, and there's also possible influence. I mean, with the Freemasonry and the Knights of the Templar, there's historical evidence to prove that these Knights of the Templar got very softened up by these Ismailis in Syria, and that they may have even converted secretly to Ismaili Shiism, and it may explain the reason why the Catholic Church became so, incensed at these guys. That 2 centuries later they excommunicated them wholesale. Now, this figure of Baphomet that appears, for example, in the Western occult tradition, the pedigree of that is with the Knights Templar. Its depiction, of course, begins in the 19th century with Eliphas Levi. But Baphomet itself, as far as scholars have been able to trace it, is a corrupted and bastardized form of the name of the Prophet of Islam, Muhammad. That
you just read my mind, because that's exactly what I was going to ask.
Yeah, that's where it comes from. So it began this figure that the church was accusing the Templars of worshiping was actually the Prophet of Islam itself, which kind of then implicitly proves that they may have made a conversion to this form of esoteric Islam, the Ismaili form.
I guess the strange thing about that is, though, the Baphomet, or whatever it was supposed to be some type of head or a face or something. Yeah. And from an Islamic perspective, you're not really supposed to make images or worship images, right? So that's kind of contradictory.
It is very contradictory, but just remember this: there are no depictions or characterizations of Baphomet in any of the literature, even the stuff that is accusing these people of worshiping this, until the middle of the 19th century with this character Eliphas Levi in France, Alphonse Louis Constant, the guy who literally spawned the whole Western occult revival.
Yeah, and I suppose the Inquisition and the King of France were sort of looking for trumped up charges, so it's hard to say what really happened there, and how much is fact versus fiction.
Yeah.
I got a question that's somewhat related to this with Eliphas Levi and all that. Is we read in the the Western world that in modern times there's kind of an externalization of the hierarchy.
Yes.
Okay, that the darker forces are coming out of the closet, so to speak.
Yeah.
Right. What they used to hide, they now brag about.
Yes.
Is that also the view in the Middle East? Right. Would you see a similar thing happening there?
Yeah, of course I would. I mean, I think the exteriorization of a hidden hierarchy basically means that it's on its last leg. Because
I'm hoping so.
Yeah, well, it means that it's been corrupted, because a true occult hierarchy will never reveal itself. Why should it?
Because they're on the dark side and they are now so corrupted internally that that's all they can do is enjoy their hoodwinking of people and things like that.
Until their final fall. But then the question becomes, were these really hidden hierarchies to begin with? Are these really the main honchos?
No, it's a fair question. Are we just dealing with flunkies again?
Probably, yeah.
We do have to wonder, are these just like, a different branch of the same people who send us politicians or whatever? Right. Yeah, that's... Okay, well, while we're on that, so how would you see things changing in the last 100 years in the Middle East in terms of these different, hidden esoteric kind of groups? What do you see?
Well, on one level, the encounter of the Muslim world with European colonialism really ravaged it, and it gave the argument away to these exteriorizers and fundamentalists, these Islamists, Salafists, Wahhabis. And so over the last 150, 200 years, the real influence of Sufism and esotericism began to disappear as everything began to materialize. I think at this point right now, we have kind of reached the last point of that process, where this exteriorization process is about to shatter. And people within the Muslim world who are clinging still to their piety and religiosity are beginning to look again back to what used to be normative Islam. And I have to say that to his credit, the late Ayatollah Khomeini, for all the things that they say about him and what a bad person he was, etc., he was responsible for keeping the flame of mystical Islam and Islamic esotericism and Islamic philosophy alive in Iran after the revolution, when you had these very reactionary, ultra-conservative mullahs who wanted to put this all down and relegate it to heresy. He kept it all alive because he represented that tradition within the seminary system and taught these texts, and according to many was an accomplished Gnostic master in his own right. So to his credit, he kept this all alive, and this has really nourished Iran and kept Iran together on at least the spiritual level for the last 36 years. And in many ways, it is to his credit that has happened. And I think this narrative now, to the extent that it's really taken over the Iranian imagination, the Iranian Islamic imagination, in time, maybe in the next 20, 30 years, will begin to trickle out of Iran itself. And in my opinion, begin to save much of the Islamic world from itself, from the ravages of these Islamists.
Okay. Might be a good time to get into Islamic eschatology and this whole idea of, the end of the world or where the world is going. Some people talk about Ahmadinejad and how, there's this movement in Islam to see the world destroyed. And at the same time, we see people in Israel trying to rebuild the temple and all that. There in the Middle East, you can't get around it. There's this undercurrent that seems to be driving things to a massive war or destruction. Yeah. And then you got these takfiris. Could you give us a little bit about how you see Islamic eschatology or some of the different views there, maybe Shia, Sunni, whatever?
Well, my personal point of view, if you've read that book by Corbin, I subscribe to the Sheikhi point of view about eschatology, and that is that all these events of prophecies happen on a completely different plane. I think material eschatology has serious problems, and we witness this over and over again throughout history. A mature spiritual and religious mind looks at a personal eschatology. The meeting with the Messiah, the meeting with the Christ, the meeting with the hidden Imam happens within the soul of each believer at the point of their transformation. To try to bring a literal Messiah into this world, at least into the spatial temporal world, to solve political conflicts in many senses is missing the point of the whole exercise. Because we're supposed to elevate ourselves beyond this stuff, not to bring that down to solve these problems for us. So, obviously in these times of great confusion and conflict, people recoil back to their literalist readings of these esoteric, or not even esoteric, prophecies in general. But what is more important is for people to then cultivate, to realize the Imam of their own being, rather than trying to bring the Imam or the Messiah into this world physically. I mean, the Jews experienced this with Sabbatai Sevi, and the experience was a catastrophe. And in many senses, we have all been suffering as a result of this catastrophe of Sabbatianism ever since, not just the Jewish world. So what,
That's putting it mildly.
Yeah. So what does it serve? I've said this to many amongst my fellow Muslims. I mean, what does it really serve to bring the Imam or the Mahdi into this world physically when, the world is, the earth is God's already, and these are dramas in the sense that need to play themselves out. Yes, it's very difficult, and we live in a very difficult time, a very scary time. Engender the Christ within yourself. Yeah.
Right. Thanks for your take. What about, just for the listening audience's take, how would you describe, a general Shiite take, a general Sunni take, the Takfiri take, whatever, just briefly?
The Shiites, of course, are awaiting the hidden Imam, the son of the son of Hassan al-Askari, who is Muhammad ibn Hassan al-Askari, the 12th Imam, who disappeared about 1,300 and something plus years ago, and who is held to arrive and come into this world after an occultation to deliver the world and fill it with justice as it has been filled with injustice. And now with this death of this Saudi king, there's all kinds of traditions and pseudo-prophecies circulating very dubious pedigrees that has some people all riled up awaiting the coming of the Mahdi, or the Imam Mahdi. The Sufi Sunnis and the more normative traditional Sunnis also have a concept of the Mahdi where the Mahdi is actually the return of Jesus. That will come at the end of time to set things right and to validate Islam, etc., etc. The Takfiris, at least the Salafist ideology, as it has mutated at this present time, doesn't really subscribe to that sort of an eschatology as such. There are some Salafists who believe in it, but as a point of doctrine, it's not a point that they emphasize. So this is why they want to reestablish the caliphate. Rather than to have the coming of the world savior as such.
So do both the Shias and Sunnis believe in the Dajjal?
Yes.
Okay, and is that essentially the same figure as the Christians would call the Antichrist?
Yeah, almost identically the same one. Yeah.
And I guess the Jews would call the Messiah.
Yeah.
Sorry, guy, I couldn't resist.
Something like that, yeah.
Yes. So I think, though, that, in that part of the world, you do have this undercurrent of people trying to bring about a disaster. Would you agree with that?
Oh, of course they are. They're trying to try the hand of God, of course. We've always been in this mess.
Yeah, but I think, in a sense, I think that there are different things here. There's this you talk about it, this literalist desire, right, to have clear answers and clear everything, and then, like, they want a description of how the Messiah is coming, or whatever, God's coming, or for that matter, Satan's coming.
Mm-hmm.
And that's one thing, and I think we get suckered by that,
Yes.
right? You can see how everybody's waiting for the next Y2K.
Yep.
Right. But then on the other hand, I think there is this serious undercurrent of dark forces that are trying to bring about a disaster in that part of the world.
Yes, they are.
And it's, it can't really be ignored that there is that movement. And what is your thinking on that darker side movement to try to blow up the Middle East? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I appeal to Return of the Jedi. And at the very point when Emperor Palpatine was at the cusp of victory, Luke Skywalker pulls his father back from the dark side, and the Emperor falls down a shaft and dies. So I think...
So it's a real story.
Yeah.
That's another archetype, right? That's another lesson for us on this... what can we call it? Sophia.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, that makes sense to me. I'm not convinced the bad guys are going to get their way. They've been trying, but they got a tough fight ahead. Maybe before we wrap it up, we could get back to Corban a bit. And as I recall in there, there's just so much that was interesting. But one of the things I seem to remember is there was something about the epics of the spiritual, the spirit, the world. Can you give some of the ideas in that book that you think people might want to look into? I remember.
Well, the imagination, the role of the imagination, the divine imagination. This is the central theme of the book, and how Sophia, the Sophianity, or the Sophia notion, and the divine imagination, or the creative imagination, are interlinked concept. That whoever engenders the creative imagination, which is a spiritual faculty, and by this we're not really talking about a fantasy, but we're talking about an actual faculty of vision of the soul, that they engender the Sophia within themselves. There's a thread that is running throughout this entire book in various ways, and also the notion of the many bodies, the spiritual bodies that the human alchemically then assembles for their elevation into the next life, if you would. The knowing of the holy guardian angels, as they call it in the occult tradition of the West.
Can you tell me, in the views in the Middle East about reincarnation, or for that matter, multiple instantiations of ourselves, in life? Can you give us the view of that?
Well, reincarnation is also a Platonic doctrine.
Yes.
It's theologically, it's not a doctrine that is accepted within many Islamic schools. The Islamic philosophers all grappled with it. Uncharacteristically, Suhrawardi rejected it, but Mullah Sadra, who came much later and is this great synthesizer of the various Islamic philosophical schools, took Suhrawardi to task for his rejection of this doctrine of reincarnation. There are, in Iran, various Ahl Haq, or who are these ultra Shiite Sufis, believe in reincarnation. They look at the perfection of the soul through many lifetimes. In the Neoplatonic context, this doctrine becomes very difficult because we are talking about multiple worlds. We are not just living within a material universe, but we are living in multiple universes. And the substance of the soul travels eternally throughout these various universes until it reaches its perfection within the highest of the lights, divine lights.
Well, that's kind of what I'm getting at, is how many, I don't know if you want to call it incarnations, how many instantiations of ourselves are we likely to have? Is there much, is that something that would be getting more into the Sufi, more mystical side?
Well, first off, the concept of the personality needs to be deconstructed. What part of ourselves is ourselves?
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the stream of universal consciousness, what can we honestly claim as our own, other than that divine spark that is already always, right?
Mm-hmm.
Which then travels through the multiverses and the eons of time. And you know, I mean, in India they call it the Atman. In Islamic esotericism and philosophy, this is called the universal soul. But this in itself already inhabits another realm. So whatever experience, you know, that is taken by a particular human being in this lifetime, in one sense it dissolves, but it also then joins that reality on a higher level.
Mm-hmm. No, that makes sense. That's is that something that within this, how would the Sufis look at that? Is that something they? I guess what I'm trying to say is there a, what can I put it? The view of life for Sufis is it's that you have these multiple levels, these multiple incarnations or instantiations of ourself, right?
Yeah.
And how many of them are taking place or will take place on Earth as opposed to on other levels?
Infinite.
Infinite.
Sure.
So it's not like past life regression where we have one life, right?
Well,
we're going back.
Again, we have to deconstruct this Western notion of the individuation of the personality. I think this is in some respects is a very helpful concept, but in other ways it's actually not true. What is the personality? Okay, what is the soul? And if the soul has a divine origin, then you know it is part of something even bigger than itself, and this something bigger is already always present infinitely. So it isn't the case that a singular soul is reincarnating again and again and again and again, having the same experience or different experiences over again. What is actually the one and only incarnate? It is the universal soul itself that is eternally incarnating.
So we're just simply part of it.
Yes, or instantiations of it. And the instantiation, in many senses, reflects the universal and is also part of the universal simultaneously.
And is that would be a common way of looking at it within a Sufi order, right?
Pretty much, yeah.
What about within the Shia view? That's going to not be okay for them, right?
The way that the Shia would formulate it is that whosoever has recognized the Imam of their time is saved. But this is a very Gnostic concept, and it's also a form of personal salvation, where in the Sheikhi school, it becomes, you know, whoever engenders the presence of the Imam of the age within themselves has already ascended to, you know, the plane of the Imam, or Galia, you know, the eighth climate of the celestial world.
Okay.
And the best way to explain this, I mean, you could write a whole book on this question alone, which I think I should leave this with your listeners. There's a tradition, it is called the tradition of ultimate reality, or the Hadith al-Haqiqa, the tradition of Kumail, where Kumail, a disciple of Ali, has a conversation with Imam Ali about the nature of ultimate reality. And this is a very Zen-like koan that has multiple levels of meaning to it that can be unpacked pretty much forever. And the conversation goes as follows. Kumail comes to Ali and says, "O commander of the faithful, what is ultimate reality?" And Ali answers, "What have you and ultimate reality to do with each other?" And Kumail responds, "Is it not the case that I'm already sharing your secrets as a companion?" Ali responds, "Yes, indeed, but that which sprinkles unto you is billowing through me unto you." So Kumail asks again, "O master, what is ultimate reality?" Ali responds, "This disclosure of the majesties of glorification without indication." Kumail asks again, "Please explain further." Ali responds, the negation of all speculation and the realization of all that which can be realized. Kumail asks again, please tell me more. Ali responds, the nullificative annihilation of the secret by the victorious rending of the veil off the mystery of the secret. Kumail asks again, please explicate further. Ali responds, the attraction of the divine oneness by the attributive apprehension of the divine unicity. Ali asks, Kumail asks again, please tell me more. Ali responds, a light illuminating from the dawn of pre-eternity and shedding its traces upon the tablets of the talismanic temples of unicity. Kumail finally asks, please tell me more. And Ali responds finally by saying, extinguish the lamp, for the dawn hath indeed arisen.
That sounds very Eastern.
Yes, now we're getting even further east.
Yeah, this is the Silk Road, right?
This is the creme de la creme of the esoteric teachings of Shiism is within this dialogue. The Hadith Kumail or Hadith al-Haqiqa, tradition of ultimate reality.
Yeah, and actually, I think in Buddhism there's actually a sect called the Complete Reality sect. Sort of Buddhism and Taoism overlapping, but again, you can definitely, in my opinion, see the cross-fertilization, along the Silk Road, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, no question. That's got a very, Eastern feeling to it. No question at all. Okay, well, Wahid, why don't we wrap it up on that? That'll give our listeners a lot to chew over. Replay that a few times. And thanks again for coming. We do appreciate it.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks,
And
Wahid.
do you want to tell our listeners how to find your information?
Sure,
Website,
you can find me
whatever.
on my blog, which is wahidazal.blogspot.com.
Okay, well, that'll do it, folks. Thanks. It's a wrap.